Hello everyone, welcome back to the Film Feast Watches 007. My name is Sam Donches, and I have not seen a majority of the James Bond films in existence, so I'm gonna fix that in this series where I watch every single one in anticipation for the new James Bond film coming out in November, Spectre. Now I have to be clear, I'm not watching every single James Bond movie, I'm just watching the ones included in the Bond 50 collection. That does not include the 1950s TV movie for Casino Royale, nor does it include the 60s Casino Royale, and it also does not include the 1983 film Never Say Never Again. It's just now getting to be September, and I am so far behind. I'm only 7 movies into this franchise, so let's get it kicked off in this episode with You Only Live Twice. After my first viewing of this movie, I hated it. It was my least favorite Bond movie up to this point in the franchise, and admittedly, it's still my second least favorite, but there was nothing like how I felt after that first viewing. And of course, I'll explain my reasoning for my distaste for this movie a little bit more into talking about it, but for now, let me just get to the plot. You Only Live Twice kicks off with a mysterious device capturing a manned American space vessel mid-orbit. This leads to an international standoff where the Americans believe Russia is to blame, but when a Russian craft is captured, the Russians believe the Americans are behind the plan to instigate war. James Bond, while on assignment in Hong Kong, is killed. That's why nobody uses Murphy beds anymore, idiot! This is a ploy by MI6 to throw off their enemies, and everything about Bond's death is faked, all the way to his funeral at sea. Bond rendezvous with a submarinal MI6 and is briefed by M about evidence pointing to Japan being behind the mysterious device. Bond heads to Tokyo, where he meets Tiger Tanaka, the reclusive head of the Japanese Secret Service.
Welcome to Japan, Mr. Bond.
Bond and Tiger work together to investigate Osato Chemicals and their use of a ship to deliver rocket fuel to a nearby port village. Bond goes deep undercover, only to discover that Spectre's insidious number one, Ernst Stavro Blofeld, is behind the warmongering scheme. Interestingly enough, this film was written by Roald Dahl, and after my first viewing I was like, wow, you can really feel his xenophobia coming out in all these very racist Japanese scenes. What with the fact that the first place James Bond goes to in Tokyo is a sumo match, and the fact that there's a ninja academy where they also train in the art of the samurai, but they also have guns.
This is my ninja training school.
And then there's the kicker of them turning James Bond into a Japanese guy, which I have no words. But when I went back to the movie to pick out footage that I would use for this video, I found a lot of interesting things about You Only Live Twice. Namely, that it is extremely well paced. It is one of the most evenly paced Bond films yet. The story details as they are given are very easy to pick up. This was the Bond film that I found myself keeping up with the most. I never had to rewind to be like, wait, who is this character? What are they doing? Who are they with? And a lot of the racially insensitive tones I was picking up on the first time, I was able to easily look past on my second go-through. Like the sumo wrestling match. I actually felt like the crew took Sean Connery to a sumo wrestling match, sat him down, and filmed him while the match just went on, unbeknownst of any cameras or anything like that. It felt very real and very respected. Also, the wedding scene, while it was long and drawn out, it felt like they actually utilized Japanese culture to advance the storyline forward. So while You Only Live Twice is clearly using Japanese culture as a crutch to tell a fairly normal Bond story, it still feels like it respects it enough. It almost feels like for every great thing You Only Live Twice does, like the beautiful locales and the great action and the awesome villain, it does 3 more bad things. Like that ridiculous bath scene, for example. That was too much.
Now you take your first civilized bath.
Really? Well, I like the plumbing.
And again, I just have to say how stupid of an idea it was to turn Bond into a Japanese guy. That never worked. And it never will work. Bad, 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 really bad move. I almost want to take a survey of Japanese people and ask them, would this ever fool you? Would this seriously ever fool you in a million years? I mean, even from a distance, it's like, hey, he's taller than 90% of the Japanese people in this movie. What is that? And I have to say this, I know some Bond fans might disagree with me, but this is just how I feel. I think MI6 faking Bond's death didn't work its way into the story well enough. It's like something that you either do or you don't do at all. And I understand why they did it, but it's something that just happens in the beginning of the movie, and then Blofeld mentions it whenever he sees Bond. If you're gonna call your movie You Only Live Twice, that should be something that works its way into the plot a little bit better. And maybe I'm a giant hypocrite, because From Russia with Love didn't have loving from Russia with a huge premise like faking the death of your franchise's main character. That should be something that kind of crops up a little bit more in the story. But just one man's opinion. I could go more in depth on the negative aspects of You Only Live Twice, like the awful awful cinematography in some of the scenes and the somewhat disappointing Blofeld reveal. I mean, that was something that you've been building up to for 5 movies, and then it's just like, hey, I'm Blofeld. But I want to focus on the awesome finale of You Only Live Twice that takes place in that gorgeous volcano base set. I could only imagine what it must have been like walking onto Pinewood Studios in London to see that thing. It must have been huge. This sequence has plenty of action and intensity to spare. Everything from Bond being in the clutches of Blofeld and his henchmen, to the piranha tank, and the numerous explosions that happen during this sequence, Blofeld making his escape, and Bond having to detonate the ship before it swallows up the American vessel in space. There's so much happening, but it's all cohesive, and it all makes sense, and there's no weirdly stunted fight with a giant Korean man. Overall, it's a good finale, and it's one of the best elements of You Only Live Twice, which is otherwise a kind of weird James Bond movie, and not incredibly likable. To me, it's no wonder why Sean Connery stepped away after this movie. You can clearly tell he's uncomfortable in a number of these scenes, so he decided to step down from the role and make way for a new guy, and that new guy was George Lazenby.
My name's Bond. James Bond.
So let's move on to On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Now, I'm not cued into the consensus for this movie when it comes to Bond fans or cinema fans in general, but for me, this movie works. It's what I look for in these kind of spy action films. A little side of romanticism just works. Of course, I'm not saying that's what a Bond film has to be, but after 5 films, this was a much welcome break from the regular Bond fare that I had been introduced to from the beginning. On Her Majesty's Secret Service begins with 007 on assignment in Portugal, where he meets Contessa Teresa, otherwise known as Tracy. She is distressed and almost kills herself before Bond saves her. Bond begins courting her, which catches the attention of Tracy's father, Marc-Ange Draco. He offers James £1 million to marry his daughter, which Bond refuses because he feels she's too unstable. However, he agrees to continue seeing her when he figures out Draco's associations might lead him to Blofeld. James eventually falls for Tracy, but leaves for the Swiss Alps when he finds out Blofeld is assuming the identity of Count Balthasar de Blochamp, who has established an allergy research clinic atop a mountain. I can't go any further into talking about On Her Majesty's Secret Service without talking about George Lazenby himself. This was his only role as James Bond, and this is the only time that that's ever happened in the franchise where the actor playing James Bond steps right into and then right out of the role. From his very first scene in the movie, you can tell that he's so much more affable than Connery ever was, displaying just as much gentlemanliness that Connery had, but a heightened charisma that Connery was never able to really achieve as his role as James Bond. Lazenby is just the type of actor who can pull off certain nuances that Connery couldn't. Like every single time Lazenby's Bond makes a quip or a little joke, I kind of feel a little bit more agreeable with it. I'm almost like, ha ha ha. But with Connery, every single time he would make a joke, I would just be like, ha ha. Oh, your eyebrows are so thick. Lazenby can also pull off a fluffy shirt. My god, there are a lot of fluffy shirts in this movie. This is also the first, and from what I've read, only time in the series that a character, in this case Bond, addresses the fact that Bond is played by a different actor.
This never happened to the other fella.
Maybe it was just a fun little elbow to the audience because Lazenby is looking into the camera, or maybe the studio thought, we should address this. People might be confused by this. I want to turn real quick to a technical standpoint and give a lot of credit to Michael Reed, who added such an immensely interesting shot design for this movie that, as far as all the Bond films that I've seen up to this point, it is the best shot one yet. And that's, excluding the ones that I have seen in the future, like Skyfall. Even in the fight scenes, you can tell that they are trying to do something different in terms of making this movie look Unlike any other Bond film before it, there's a lot of crash zooms in the early sequences where whenever they do a punch, they like fly zoom into it, like boom, this is where a guy is getting punched. I love that kind of stuff, especially in the 1960s when everyone was trying to do something different with their movies. And speaking of trying something different, On Her Majesty's Secret Service in general is just the movie that shakes up the Bond franchise in very interesting ways. Number one, the romantic subplot. At first, I didn't really know what to think about the Contessa Teresa, or Tracy. Like, the first 2 or 3 scenes that she was in, I was like, where are they going with this character? I mean, is this supposed to be the main Bond girl of this movie, or is she gonna die off early and then they're gonna introduce somebody else? But as the film progressed, she grew on me, and even by the end of the film, I was like, yeah, this is my favorite Bond girl, by a mile. Tracy is portrayed by Diana Rigg, who you might know better from Game of Thrones. She plays Olenna Tyrell on that show, and she is a fan favorite. She adds so much life and humor to the film, and you can actually tell that this is a character who Bond would fall for. It's very convincing that, you know, Bond, after all of these women that he's gone through, he actually finds someone who makes him happy. So yeah, you know, I ship that. I ship that like crazy. Anyway, moving on to the new Blofeld, portrayed by a different actor in this film by a man named Telly Savalas, a Greek man who portrayed this role very well. Honestly, he may have done it better than Donald Pleasance, and I know that's definitely an unpopular opinion because Donald Pleasance is the fucking man. But let's just look at the facts here. This Blofeld occupies a lot more cinematic real estate in this film. So much more than the Blofeld of You Only Live Twice, who only got a lot of screen time at the very end. This Blofeld occupies the second half of the movie, and he's constantly there doing stuff. He's actually like with his henchmen on those slopes chasing after Bond. And this Blofeld actually has a diabolical scheme that kind of scares the shit out of me. It's something that I want to see Bond put an end to. It's a diabolical scheme with an end game. And then when Tracy gets captured, the stakes are risen to their ultimate peak. This was the first time I thought to myself, Bond, you gotta get in there, you gotta save the day, you gotta go get the girl. And that's not to say that Tracy is a damsel in distress. Even as a captive, she is feisty, and she fucks a couple of dudes up on her way out of there. By the way, what was the deal with those wall spikes there? I mean, were they just like decoration? At the end of the day, On Her Majesty's Secret Service is far from perfect. You never really get 100% used to Lazenby as Bond, and it's not that he doesn't do a great job in the role, it's just something that I was never fully comfortable with, like I was able to get with Connery over the course of 5 films. It's got more than a couple of silly moments, but it is the first film in the Bond series to actually explore Bond in a very inward way. I'd even say that this is the first Bond film where you actually kind of explore James's heart, and you understand what makes the character tick, and what's beneath all of the mystique and intrigue and the tuxedo. All of these things that make the iconic James Bond character, there's so much more to that. And those are my feelings on Her Majesty's Secret Service. It's definitely up there as one of my favorite Bond films as of right now, but I'm ready to explore the last film in this episode.
Diamonds are forever.
Forever, ever, forever, ever, 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 ever. So with George Lazenby out of the picture, we move on to the next new James Bond. His name is Sean Connery. Why does that name sound familiar?
My name is Bond. James Bond.
Sean Connery. Have we seen this guy play Bond before? I don't remember. I have to say, I love this opening sequence. It just shoots right into the action. Bond is on a manhunt for Blofeld. He's out for blood. He wants to find this man at any cost. And Bond actually manages to kill Blofeld before the title sequence ever happens, which of course means that Blofeld isn't actually dead. But I love that, you know, they just had the tenacity to really take Bond in there and just say, hey, I'm gonna kill you. But honestly, I'm gonna breeze by Diamonds Are Forever because it ended up being my least favorite Bond film yet. And I had to kind of realize that after going in and mining footage from it, that I was just like, hey, this is not a great movie. Again, Sean Connery is back as Master Spy James Bond. And in this film, he's trying to bust a diamond smuggling ring, which actually ends up being Blofeld running the whole game. And it has something to do with a satellite that can shoot a laser. I don't really remember. and I don't really care to remember, and even after basically watching the movie twice, I still don't really know what this movie was about. This is the second 007 film directed by Guy Hamilton, and while you can definitely tell that he's trying to bring back some of the energy that he gave Goldfinger, none of it really works on a story-driven level, because Bond films have to operate on a narrative, and this is just a really weak narrative. And in general, I've kind of found that to be the case with a lot of the Bond films, that they are basically a trial and error of what works and what doesn't work in terms of telling a good story in cinematic form. Sometimes a movie is great, it has really great action sequences, but the story kind of dips here and there. And sometimes the story is great, it's so elegant and wonderfully told, but the action kind of takes a back seat to that. And in this case, neither of those elements are really firing on all cylinders. It's just a flat movie overall. I can't deny the few good elements of this movie, like the fact that Sean Connery is just pure charm in this movie, and that elevator fight sequence is great. It kind of harkens back to the train sequence in From Russia with Love. But then, going back to the negatives, this movie has the worst Bond girls of them all. Tiffany Case is a ditz.
My God. You just killed James Bond.
Is that who it was?
And Plenty O'Toole, for the one scene that she's around for, is very annoying.
You know something, Peter Franks? You're a terrific guy. A little weird, but a terrific guy.
And then, of course, it can't really be a Bond film without those silly, fantastical elements to it. But this one might just take it too far. Like whenever he takes a hovercraft ferry boat for no reason. It's never mentioned as like an integral thing to the plot. It's just something that he does. And then there was the moon rover chase, which, as dumb as it was, I actually got a bit of a kick out of it. It was like a cheap, goofy Mad Max Fury Road. But then Blofeld shows up in drag, and I was like, hold on, what is this really? Is this a Looney Tunes cartoon? Is that what I'm watching right now? Because that's what it feels like. And for the most part, I just feel like Diamonds Are Forever was a wasted opportunity. Early on in the film, you see these scenes of these workers in Africa, in the mines, getting the diamonds, and then they're smuggling them through a dentist's office, and, just to kind of run them up the ranks so that they can be sold on the black market or wherever. But on a small scale, that would have worked so well. Bond goes to Africa and busts up some slave shops or whatever. That would have been an interesting movie, but no. These movies, again, are a product of their time. That wouldn't have been a story that would have interested moviegoers or studio execs or anyone really at that time, because no one cared about what was going on in Africa back then. It was just, let's tell fantastical action-adventure stories. And those are my feelings on what I consider to be the very disappointing Diamonds Are Forever. And so ends this episode of the Film Feast Watches. As always, I encourage y'all very much to interact with me in the comments below. You can also hit me up on the Film Feast Facebook page or my Twitter account at the Film Feast, and then I post little individual blurb reviews about each of these movies on my Letterboxd account. Again, if you don't have one of those, you should get one if you love watching movies. It's a really great website. I'm definitely pushing for more discussion with this series, and while I did get a little bit of feedback on my last video, I want more this time around. If you're a Bond fan, or if you're still just trying to get into the series, or if you're somewhere in the middle, I want you to talk to me about these movies. On the next episode, I'll be jumping into the first batch of films starring Roger Moore as James Bond, which is very exciting for me. I have not seen any films with him starring in them, so this will be something very new for me. And that's all for this episode of the Film Feast Watches 007. Thank you guys so much for watching. Give this video a like if you enjoy it, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I will see y'all on the next episode.
In Japan, men always come first. Women come second.
I might just retire to here.